So we're talking here with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz here on the Mark Steiner Show and the Real News Network, talking about her book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And you know, as we go into this, let me just kind of segue into something here. We talked about Andrew Jackson, but nothing happens in America or anywhere else politically unless there's a cultural backbone to it.
Right.
Right?
It's a democracy.
Right. And part of your cultural backbone, and this is also, again, when I read this part of your book, it struck me because it's sort of challenging my sense of who some of the people who I love to read, who they were.
Yes.
Right? So you talked about James Fenimore Cooper and the Leatherstocking and what all the great poets and transcendentalist poets, Whitman and Emerson and the rest, and the role they played culturally establishing the right to do what we were doing to have genocide against Native people in this country.
Yes, they. A lot of that came out with the invasion of Mexico in 1846. That they showed their true colors, you know, of being Walt Whitman in particular, and being totally racist. And of course, they considered Mexico a country of Indians. They call them Indian. They used the N-word, Injuns, and the N-word. This was, you know, whole diatribes that Whitman published in his own newspaper of why Mexico should be taken, the whole of Mexico, and colonized and, you know, treated like the Indians and African Americans, putting them under tutelage and kind of paternalistic regime and take their wealth because they didn't know what to do with it. And there's very rich resources there. But yeah, they came out of the Jackson era. That you can't delink the Leatherstocking tales, artificially created an origin story that hadn't yet gelled. And it's basically the origin story is so much like apartheid South Africa, where or Israel, where this God-given, you know, manifest destiny handing over from the Native people, you know, in the last of the Mohicans, handing over the kind of keys to the country, like it's yours now. We've had our time here. We're dying out. So now you, the settler, of course that's Daniel Day-Lewis in the movie.
Right.
And you know everything we know. You know, you're the woodsman, you're the hunter, and not the farmer, a hunter. And therefore, you have to carry on. And it's a gift.
As if the Indians were dead people. It was over.
Yeah, they're dead people, but they're very generous. You know, you know, as we leave, we want to hand over the keys to the country to you, and you be the caretaker now.
I think that setting that relationship up between the two is kind of very critical, understanding who we are and why we are the way we are.
Right.
You know, and I think you segued so many interesting things here with that. There's a portion in this book later on where you talk about President John F. Kennedy.
Right, the new frontier.
The new frontier, and I was really, this is a wonderful chapter, a Ghost Dance Prophecy.
Right.
And a nation is coming, and you have this piece about Kennedy in here, where when he's addressing America at Democratic National Convention in 1960. And he said that he asked his audience to see him as a new kind of frontiersman confronting a different kind of wilderness. I stand tonight facing the West, which was once the last frontier. From the lands that stretched 3,000 miles behind me, the pioneers of old gave up their safety, their comfort, and sometimes their lives. They built a new world here in the West. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, a frontier of unknown opportunities and paths, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. And tie that back to the historian Frederick Jackson Turner and others to talk about this interesting link. I want you to explain to the listeners from your perspective, tying that to the settler roots, to the genocide of Native people, and where America is going. You see that as all tied into the perspective on Native people and from Native people.
And fighting communism, that's the new
Right.
frontier, defeating communism, and it took 20 more years, but they did it. 30 more years.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that was repeated almost verbatim by Obama in his 2009
Which you also talk about. Right.
inauguration, almost word for word plagiarized that another new frontier, and of course he was riffing on Lincoln, which we should also mention because Lincoln was a free soiler. And that meant he followed in the tradition of Jackson as wanting to give this possibly volatile, landless white class of settlers a land so that they would, be satisfied. And they're just, the native people were resisting fiercely being driven off their lands and being colonized. And then always the land, when it was given, like under Jackson, given to smallholders, unless they could purchase slaves, which are very expensive, they couldn't compete with the big planters. So they would go broke, and then they'd move on to, get some new land somewhere else. And I say, in Oklahoma, where my dad and others ended up, were the losers because they just kept losing land. And they end up there, a bunch of sharecroppers and then Dust Bowl Okies on the West Coast. There's just, under that system, there's really no way. It always floats to the top.
Right.
But Lincoln thought he wanted to take that plantation land and divide it up among, he wasn't really thinking of African Americans, he was thinking of these white, landless white settlers getting land. But that was the free soiler movement, was to take land. It was in Minnesota and the Great Lakes area, and that's where wars were going on. During the Civil War, a number of wars against Native people, against the Navajos, against the Minneconjou Sioux in Minnesota. So there are these parallel wars going on with the Civil War, and that's another thing I put in there. I follow, where the Native Americans, and here's Lincoln trying to implement this free land, and then freed Africans also were given land grants. Those who fought in the Civil War were also given land grants taken from native lands in Oklahoma and elsewhere. So everyone became complicit in this system because it is a system, and it's a system of if you make the native people kind of invisible and not as players, well, this land is just to be doled out,
And you're saying it's implicit because it's implicit in the system because it can't help itself. That is the system. That's how it's designed, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
As looking at it through native eyes as a historian, that's what you're saying.
It's the way it's designed, and for the first more than a century of the United States was a rural country, so land was the main commodity. And still today, real estate is, it's called real estate, is still the bulwark. It's not in every country in the world, but in the United States, it's still the bulwark of wealth, is real estate. And that's peculiar too. Making all land divisible and sold in plots as a commodity, something unique to the United States.
And I think as we can kind of conclude here some of this, that there's so much in this book, and especially in the beginnings when you write about the native world, what was here before the Europeans got here, and the open forests that were cleared, and the roads that went all through America that allowed native people to trade and meet with each other, and how that's how corn moved from Mexico, from Latin America, Mexico, up to the rest,
upstate New York.
Upstate New York, right? And there was the world that existed that was very different, and in some native cultures, a very democratic world that existed, with varying degrees, with men and women, all kinds of issues, but a democratic world. And I wonder, when you look at all the contradictions from America's great bards of freedom and transcendental thought, and even some of the abolitionists who wanted to move the Indians out so the land could be opened up, and all saw America's destiny kind of wrapped up in colonizing the continent, which meant getting rid of native people.
Right.
So, what is that? What are all those contradictions lead us to now? I mean, and the complexities of indigenous people and African American folks and that complex relationship from Bacon's War to today, right? So I mean, how you see that kind of playing out as a conversation for the 21st century?
Yeah, the interpretation, of like Bacon's rebellion in the colonial Virginia. This was one of the aristocratic people, Nathaniel Bacon, in the House of Burgess, who became sympathetic with the landless white people, and there were a good many then free blacks who wanted land too. So, progressive historians of the present are very excited when they find here's a black and white alliance,
Right.
To fight the power that was, the House of Burgess. Then you look underneath, it's that what were they demanding? They were demanding the House of Burgess form a militia and go out and drive the Indians off so they could have this land. And so it's so filled with every story that seems like an exciting moment of some kind of progressive moment in U.S. history. You scrape away the kind of
Unless you're native,
unless
it's
you're
not so
native,
progressive.
yeah, and then you're wait a minute.
Right.
So even Howard, explained that in his People's History, but you still see it popping up. I feel very optimistic because, the United States is we those of us in the '60s that began dismantling the empire intellectually, anyway. We were looking at least those of us who were put imperialism in the forefront, which I think was the most important part of those '60s movements. We saw, and I think that was led by people like Malcolm X. It was led, by the Civil Rights Movement. It was Paul Robeson who went to the United Nations, and we charged genocide, and Malcolm went to Africa and the Middle East. So that gave a momentum to the anti-imperialist movement. And I think we began to dismantle, but we really didn't then look at the continent as the platform for imperialism. That was imperialism, taking of the continent, not just Mexico. That used to be just called manifest destiny, taking Mexico. It wasn't even called imperialism.
Right.
Taking half of a whole, independent country, not a
It was a good thing, manifest destiny.
Yeah.
A positive term.
Right. It's very positive, right? And so we didn't really question U.S. history, and even as I was doing Native American history, more and more North American Native history rather than Latin American, and then I got back to Nicaragua in the 1980s to Central America, but really focusing on how do we reframe the whole of United States history in the world. And I'm hoping this book is of course, all Native people, all the books they write, have the Native perspective. And there's so many great Native historians and scholars right now. It's just, when I got my doctorate in 1974, there were about 5 Native American PhDs in the United States. And now there are hundreds, and others on their way, and they're brilliant. And putting out wonderful books, and a lot of them tribal histories, so with the Native perspective. And so I thought this is, really important to have something that was like the overview, and putting the United States in a world system too. The sort of Wallerstein thing of, you always have to look at the world system. Ever since Columbus, it's been a world system. It didn't just happen with globalization,
Right.
in the 1990s. And you have to relate all of these things, the United States and the world, but also the taking of the continent has to be a part of that world changing system. You know, even in the 19th century, Europeans were commenting on, before the United States had become the dominant power in the world, which it did by the 1990s. You know, people think it's only post-World War II, but by at the end of the frontier, 1890, sort of marked by the Wounded Knee Massacre, and then they moved to, you know, the Caribbean and the Philippines and overseas, and Hawaii, overseas imperialism. It was already the dominant, you know, the dominant economic power in the world and dominant military in the world. And that's minimized as well, you know, in U.S. history. It's like it was this, you know, it's kind of this accident that the United States just kind of fell into being, you know, the policeman of the world. We don't really
Just
want
an
to hear
accident.
this congressman, you know, arguing about ISIS and whether or not they should fund them. And, you know, they said, well, we've got to do it. It's our responsibility. You know, we're making these sacrifices, you know, like, and people believe this. I mean, U.S. people believe this, and they say, why aren't they funding our communities, you know? But so much of the wealth that we have is 6% of the world's population and 40% of the world's GDP comes from, you know, just fell from the heavens. You know, just some kind of natural.
It came from a manifest destiny.
Yeah, or we're, you know, just really good luck, you know, of some sort. But it was like fighting tooth and nail. Every inch of land that was taken was, you know, had to be fought for. And that formation, we really have to look at it in every way. Why this is the most violent country in the world? Not just why it's the richest and most powerful. Why is it the most violent country in the world? And deeply, deeply violent, and that, you know, the number of guns in Canada and Switzerland, where there's virtually no homicide at all, is the same as per capita in the United States. So why is that the guns seem to kill more in the United States than they do elsewhere?
And I think finally, this has been a great conversation, and I think that the importance of this book for me, I think for anybody who picks it up and reads it in Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, is that it's one of the first encompassing Native views of America and who we are, and why we are who we are today, and not pulling punches about of the mythology that we create around ourselves, but why the system of imperialism and colonialism and racism we have in this country is rooted in what started us as a nation. And I just think, first of all, this is a book all should look at. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. And Roxanne, it's been a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming to the studios here
It's
at the Real
wonderful
News
to be
Network.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm Mark Steiner for WEAA 88.9 FM, the voice of the community and the Real News Network.